Survivor Series 1997. Bret Hart has just been put in his own signature move by his on-screen and off-screen nemesis, HBK Shawn Michaels. The match is taking place at the Molson Center, now known as the Bell Center, in Montreal, Quebec, Canada. Bret Hart is the WWF champion and a hero to the people of Canada. As the sharpshooter is applied, referee Earl Hebner gets up and calls for the bell. Clear to those in attendance and to those watching at home, Bret Hart did not tap out. Bret had just been screwed out of the WWF Championship. Earl Hebner immediately leaves the arena, Shawn Michaels quickly bolts backstage, and Hart spits in the face of the company's CEO, Vince McMahon. Just like that, the show is over. This is an infamous, unscripted moment where backstage politics played out on screen, and it couldn't have been more real. However, there are some who contest that this event was part of the show like any other match. Scott Hall, who is a close friend of both Shawn and Triple H, believes that this event was, quote, a total work. Perhaps more notably, Earl Hebner himself recently stated that he believes this event to be staged. These two are not alone. There's a large number of people online who believe that all the participants involved were in on the Montreal Screwjob. The story of the Montreal Screwjob has been told many times before and is nothing new to the wrestling community. This is perhaps the most infamous event in WWF history, and they've had some doozies. To give a brief overview, HBK and Bret Hart are two of the best in-ring workers of all time and are both vying for the top spot in the company. Despite their career parallels, they couldn't be more different as individuals. Bret Hart is a straight-laced person who carries himself with moral integrity, and Shawn Michaels is not. These characters portrayed on screen are not far removed from their real-life personalities, if at all. And these differences, as well as the competitive nature of the business, led to the two butting heads backstage multiple times, sometimes literally. This made for very interesting TV as their real-life feud spilled out onto the screen, with subliminal messaging sprinkled throughout their on-screen promos and constant one-upsmanship in the ring, making for some all-time classic matches with real drama added to the mix. In 1996, in one of the greatest matches of all time, Bret Hart would lose the WWF Championship to Shawn Michaels in a 60-minute Iron Man match at WrestleMania 12. Following the pinfall, Shawn Michaels would tell Bret to get the f*** out of my ring. Following WrestleMania 12, Bret would take 7 months off from the WWF. As is the case with most of the stories from this time period, WCW plays a large role in this situation. With Bret taking time off, it was speculated that he could be leaving the WWF entirely. Bret himself was even contemplating retirement. WCW, who is now destroying the WWF in the ratings, was very interested in stealing Bret away from the company. During his time off, Bret Hart would fly to LA to record a guest appearance for The Simpsons. During this visit, Bret would meet with Eric Bischoff. Bret, not really wanting to leave the WWF out of loyalty to Vince, threw out some massive numbers, telling Bischoff that for him to even be interested, he would need $3 million a year for 3 years and a much lighter schedule. Just 3 days later, Bischoff would call Bret with almost exactly that offer, with $2.8 million a year for 3 years and a cap of 180 dates per year. Bret would tell Vince about the offer, with McMahon stating he simply couldn't match it. Hart still had reservations about leaving, so he asked Vince to simply make him the best offer he could. Vince personally flew to Calgary to speak with Hart, where he offered him a staggering 20-year deal. This deal was reported to be a $1 million a year contract, but that's not entirely accurate. The deal instead consisted of $1.5 million a year as a wrestler for the first 3 years, then would drop down to $500,000 a year for 7 years as an advisor to Vince, then down to $250,000 a year for 10 years. Bret would ultimately sign this deal just an hour before his return to WWF TV. Shawn Michaels, who was the champion, was furious. HBK was earning $750,000 a year and had asked that nobody out-earn him with the exception of The Undertaker. This led to confrontations backstage between HBK and Vince McMahon. While Vince was initially fine with the deal, he would soon sour on it and develop a case of buyer's remorse. Bret Hart's return to the company did give the ratings a small boost, but nowhere near enough to compete with WCW. At SummerSlam 1997, Bret Hart would win the WWF Championship from The Undertaker, and soon after, Vince McMahon would attempt to renegotiate and eventually cancel the 20-year deal, with Vince stating that he simply couldn't afford it due to the company's financial difficulties. The meetings in which the contract was eventually canceled is where the conspiracy theories would eventually come into play. During these meetings and subsequent canceling of the 20-year contract, McMahon would openly encourage Bret Hart to negotiate with WCW. It's important to note that at this time, the two were still on very good terms. Hart himself didn't want to leave as he didn't like the edgy presentation of WCW and felt a loyalty to Vince McMahon. Nevertheless, a $9 million contract was impossible to ignore, and Vince could understand that. As part of the 20-year deal, Hart had it stipulated that should McMahon ever cancel this contract, Hart would have a 30-day exit period in which Hart would have creative control over his match finishes, meaning that Hart could exit the company however he saw fit. With the 20-year contract now dead, Vince would reportedly help Hart by acting as an advisor to renegotiate for the same $9 million deal from Eric Bischoff. Bischoff would ultimately offer him that same deal, and Bret was officially leaving for the competition. However, Bret had just won the WWF Championship, and he needed to drop the belt. Vince McMahon had decided that he would be dropping the title at Survivor Series to none other than HBK Shawn Michaels. This should have been great and all parties should have been happy. Shawn would love to pin Bret one last time, Hart would get a great deal in WCW, and Vince would save a ton of money. However, Survivor Series was in Canada, and Hart didn't want to lose in his home country. Bret was perhaps overthinking the significance of this a little bit, but with Hart having creative control, Vince had no choice. The official story is that Bret Hart simply wanted the match to end in a no contest, and he would forfeit the title the following night on Raw. However, McMahon would grow paranoid that Bret Hart would instead appear on Nitro the following night with the WWF title. This has happened before, and Vince had every reason to suspect Bischoff could pull any sort of underhanded tactic to further drive the WWF out of business. Just 2 years prior, Medusa, aka Alundra Blaze, would infamously drop the WWF Women's Championship in the trash live on Nitro. McMahon couldn't afford that happening with the company's most prestigious title, and at Survivor Series 1997, Bret Hart would unknowingly lose the title. But that's just what we're told. According to many people online, there's just as likely a chance that this whole screw job was scripted. With Hart having creative control, what better way to leave a company than in extremely controversial fashion? Getting screwed out of the title makes him the most talked about star in the wrestling industry. Not only that, but Shawn Michaels, who is staying on WWF TV, has just as much mystery surrounding him as Bret Hart does. HBK would be the biggest heel in the wrestling world and could feud with up-and-coming stars like The Rock and Stone Cold Steve Austin. This also forces Vince McMahon into the spotlight. Survivor Series 1997 is conveniently the first time McMahon has not been on the commentary team and instead was sitting at ringside the entire time. You can ask any wrestling historian and they'll all tell you that this glob of spit was the moment the Mr. McMahon character was born. This character would of course go on to feud with Steve Austin and ultimately win the war against WCW. According to some, it's just as likely that during that same meeting where Vince told Bret to renegotiate with WCW, they also laid out this entire plan. With the two of them being on good terms at this point, it's possible that they hatched this scheme together. The wheels were already in motion, and there is some compelling evidence to suggest that this could have been staged. Some people believe McMahon was never known to be the owner of the company until after the Screwjob, but that's not exactly true. 1 year prior, on September 23, 1996, JR publicly outs Vince McMahon as the owner of the company live on Raw.
Egotistical owner of the World Wrestling Federation. I'm talking about Vince McMahon.
This meant that McMahon was already introduced to their audience as the owner of the company well before the Screwjob was ever conceived. Not only that, but Vince McMahon had already tested the waters with a heel Mr. McMahon character in Memphis, Tennessee. From what I can gather, from 1993 all the way up until 1997, McMahon would on occasion show up in USWA to cut heel Mr. McMahon promos, setting up one-off matches or short angles for the company. This promotion basically acted as a developmental territory for the WWE long before they had OVW or NXT. It's reasonable to think that McMahon used this territory to work on a heel character that he had in mind. According to believers of the Screwjob conspiracy, the Mr. McMahon character debuting after the Screwjob was always the plan, as it was something he had been working on for years prior. Screwjobs themselves aren't exactly new to the business either. There have been plenty throughout the history of wrestling, but perhaps most notably with Wendy Richter a little over a decade prior. In 1985, Wendy Richter would defeat the Fabulous Moolah and become the women's champion, thus giving Richter leverage to pressure McMahon into giving her a more lucrative contract. The story goes that in November of 1985, McMahon offered said contract to her just as she was about to head to the ring for a title defense in Madison Square Garden. When she wouldn't sign it then and there, Vince decided to simply take the belt off of her. In her match against the Spider Lady, Richter immediately realized that it was, hilariously, just the Fabulous Moolah in disguise. The ref counted her shoulders down despite kicking out at 1, and Spider Lady, was announced as the winner. Richter, realizing she had been screwed, quickly grabbed her title and went straight to the airport in her gear, and we wouldn't see her in the WWF again for over 2 decades. Contrast this with the Montreal Screwjob. The WWF almost never mentioned it again. When speaking about the event, they would quickly gloss over what happened and move on to the next segment. Even today, we rarely hear about the original Screwjob of Wendy Richter. In the case of the Montreal Screwjob, they were talking about it the very next night. Shawn Michaels would cut promos about it, and Vince McMahon infamously went on TV to discuss the situation. All this to say, the Screwjob as a concept was nothing new to wrestling or Vince McMahon. This proves that screwing over a wrestler for real isn't beyond McMahon to attempt, but it also proves that running a Screwjob angle isn't necessarily out of the question either. In fact, the WWF had already been playing with a Screwjob-like angle with Bret Hart himself. On 3 separate instances that I could find, Bret's infamous fits of aggression in Montreal would play out in scripted events months prior to the Screwjob. On January 19, 1997 at the Royal Rumble, Bret Hart would eliminate Steve Austin, but the refs would miss the elimination. This would lead to Austin sneaking back in and eliminating the remaining participants, including Bret. Claiming to have been screwed, Bret would go ballistic by threatening referees and even grabbing and yelling at Vince McMahon, who was at the announce desk. This was quite clearly part of the show, but it's yet another instance of blurring the lines between what's real and what's not, especially in regard to portraying Vince as having more backstage power than most fans realized at the time. On March 17, 1997, Bret Hart would lose the title to Psycho Sid in a steel cage. After the match, as the ring crew were disassembling the cage, McMahon would enter the ring with a seemingly enraged Bret Hart. Bret would shove McMahon to the ground and cut a work-shoot promo on how McMahon and everyone backstage were screwing Bret Hart out of the WWF title.
This is bullshit! You screw me, everybody screws me, and nobody does a goddamn thing about it!
Then, on July 21st, 1997, they did it again, this time with much more realism. Interestingly, Raw was in Canada on this night in Halifax, Nova Scotia. After HBK would announce himself as the special guest referee for Bret Hart vs. Undertaker at the upcoming SummerSlam, Bret would storm down the ramp during a Triple H match and get in Vince's face. Claiming the WWF were screwing him by placing Shawn in the match, Hart would confront Vince and even slap the headset off of his head. This looked much more like what we would see in Montreal just a few months later, with the angle presenting a lot more realism and some genuine fury on the faces of Bret and Vince McMahon. All this to say, there is some evidence to suggest that the Screwjob could have been a well-planned and well-executed scripted event, with the participants having practiced it multiple times beforehand. However, none of this directly disproves that it was real. In fact, there's significantly more proof that it was real than not. Scott Hall believed it was a work simply because he felt there was no way McMahon would keep the cameras on Bret while he spelt out WCW. Hall believed that if it was real, the cameras would have quickly cut away and none of the post-match shenanigans would have ever happened on air. Except none of that actually happened. The footage you're seeing is an original VHS recording of the event. Almost none of what we know Bret did ever made it to air. We do see him spit on McMahon as that happened almost straight away, but we don't see that famous close-up shot during the broadcast, nor do we see the spelling out of WCW or the trashing of the monitors at ringside. What we do see is Shawn grabbing the belt right after the match and Triple H and Gerald Briscoe quickly escorting Shawn to the back. As HBK leaves, the show immediately goes off air. Cameras are always rolling during any WWE event, and we know the WWE has a deep archive of footage. In this case, the footage Hall references as being proof of a work mainly comes from future retellings of the incident. As for Earl Hebner, the referee of the match who has since stated he believes it to be a work, Earl has changed his story now and then over the years. In 2020, he brought up the subject again, claiming that it was all a work. However, his reasoning behind it doesn't shed much light on the situation. Earl Hebner appeared on the In the Room podcast where he's quoted as saying, "At that time, I really didn't think it was a work. Today, I think it was. Somebody had to be the gopher, somebody had to ring the bell, and to make it look official, it was me. If you look back at the tapes, Vince and Sergeant Slaughter was at that ring. Regardless of whether I rang that bell or not after the sharpshooter, somebody was gonna ring it to make it official. This doesn't really explain how it was staged. If anything, it kind of further proves that if Hebner wasn't going to ring the bell, somebody else would have, because it was real. Hebner went on to talk about a book that he was working on, which one could assume was the reasoning behind drumming up a little bit of controversy.
What is your take on the Montreal Screwjob?
I personally believe that it was the most well-orchestrated work in the history of the business. It was just very odd to me that Bret was there with a camera crew to document the whole thing. The way it went down, it just, in hindsight, all these years later, it was just the perfect storm, and we just don't get those very often in the world of sports entertainment, pro wrestling.
Justin Credible was not there that night. However, he brings up the camera crew that was filming Bret Hart behind the scenes for an upcoming documentary. This is commonly pointed to as proof of a work, with the idea being it seems a little too convenient that Bret Hart had a full camera crew documenting the infamous night. However, they weren't there for that night specifically, and producing the eventual documentary was anything but convenient. The filmmaker Paul J. had already begun working with Bret Hart before the signing of that 20-year contract. In fact, when Vince McMahon visited Bret Hart in Calgary, it was requested by Bret Hart that the documentary team have full backstage access, to which Vince agreed. The production company had a separate contract with the WWF, allowing the production to use WWF footage as well as the names and likeness of those involved in the final cut. The camera crew had been following Bret for over a year when they eventually caught the behind-the-scenes footage of the Screwjob. Documentaries were gaining popularity, and so was the world of pro wrestling. Other documentaries were filmed around this time period, and Bret Hart was a major star. It's not too far-fetched to think that a film company called the National Film Board of Canada wanted to film a documentary about a Canadian superstar. Some people say that there's no way McMahon would have let the documentary be produced after the Montreal Screwjob. However, McMahon was in fact worried about how he would be portrayed in the project. McMahon even tried to shut it down by refusing to provide footage or signing the necessary waivers for names and likeness. Interestingly, WCW heard about this and offered to fund a lawsuit against McMahon and the WWF over this breach in contract. WCW also offered the production company a pay-per-view slot to air the documentary. Having caught wind of this, Vince backed down and allowed the production of the documentary to go ahead as intended, with the condition that they wouldn't sell it to Turner Broadcasting. Vince did, however, throw his weight around and killed some of the distribution deals that they had in place. Most people who believed the Screwjob was a work claim that the results were very convenient for those involved, albeit a little mismanaged. The claim is that all those involved would go on to become major successes in their own ways. Hart would receive a massive contract for his final few years in the business, Michaels would become an even bigger heel in the WWF, and Vince would debut the Mr. McMahon character and defeat WCW in the ratings. Things didn't exactly pan out for Bret Hart in WCW, but still, the belief is that the three of them orchestrated a plan to maximize their successes going forward. This isn't exactly proof, as there are often many happy accidents or necessary pivots in the world of pro wrestling. In regard to the McMahon character, while yes, he had been seemingly testing the waters, Vince reportedly felt he would come across as the babyface in the Screwjob situation, believing that Bret would be perceived as the bad guy, especially after punching Vince backstage. 1 week after the incident, McMahon would deliver the infamous Bret screwed Bret interview, and while this entire interview is a pretty odd thing to air on Monday Night Raw, there's no indication that he's intentionally setting up a heel character. Still sporting a black eye from Bret Hart's punch, which he outright confirms in this segment, he appears to put Bret over while making himself the victim. The fans wouldn't accept him as a victim, so McMahon would ultimately pivot, but there's no indication that he's being a heel during this segment. The Rock, on multiple occasions, had to pivot his character due to the fan reception, the most recent example being his involvement in WrestleMania 40. Pivots like this are nothing new now, and they weren't new then. As for Bret, while yes, he was planning to retire sometime in the next few years, his WCW run was a disaster, and multiple sources, including Bischoff himself, claim that Bret's enthusiasm just wasn't there from the moment he stepped into a WCW locker room. It was clear that he didn't want to be there and was unhappy with the way things had panned out. The evidence of the screwjob being a work is far outweighed by the evidence of real-life politics playing out on screen in a major way. Jim Cornette, Vince Russo, and Triple H have all claimed to have had a hand in suggesting a legitimate screwjob finish to the match in question. Cornette and Russo both recall a meeting with the two of them and Vince McMahon where they tried desperately to find a viable finish to this match that didn't involve screwing Bret Hart. For some reason, Russo and Cornette argue to this day about whose idea it was, but nevertheless, their accounts of the matter line up pretty closely, with both of them stating that Vince spoke with Bret on the phone multiple times, and none of the ideas that they were coming up with were ever accepted by the hitman. Both Russo and Cornette stated that they believed a resolution would be made the day of the pay-per-view, and were just as surprised as anybody else to see that they were actually going through with the screwjob. Cornette himself stating that he left the arena almost immediately. At the end of the day, the reality of the situation seems to be that Vince did not want to screw Bret out of the title, but his distrust in the opposition led him down a path of uncertainty and was ultimately left with no option. I don't intend to paint McMahon in a positive light here, but simply looking at the evidence, I don't believe he wanted this particular outcome until he felt he had no option. Bret simply didn't want to job to Shawn Michaels, least of all in Canada, which is and has always been the official story. Over 25 years later, there's very little proof that Bret Hart was ever in on it. So with Bret refusing any finish that was pitched to him, it seems as though the reality of the Montreal Screwjob is unfortunately the same today as it was in 1997, when McMahon first uttered the words, "Bret screwed Bret."